So welcome everyone to session 3 of Board Basics for the Mid-America region. My name is David Pyle. It's been fun to be with you all for the previous 2 sessions, which are recorded on the Mid-America website. I am grateful that you all are here with us again tonight for what is really the most, how do I put this, the most grab baggy of the 3 sessions, the most where we're putting as much stuff as possible into as small a container. Now, as I promised, we are going to begin now at 7 o'clock, at 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern. This is a 75-minute webinar. We will be ending by 9:15 Eastern, 8:15 Central. And unlike last time, I promise, I'm going to get us through all of the material. Now, as you know, we are recording, so thank you for being willing to stay with us while we are recording. And this will be posted to the MidAmerica website, usually in about 3 to 4 days. And when we post it, we will also post with it the slides, and we will also be posting with it a couple of 1 or 2 other resources that we talk about tonight. So it's wonderful, but as I said, this is the most packed, filled version of the 3 webinars with the most disparate stuff. So hang with me, take a deep breath. Know there's going to be a recording if you miss something, and you're going to get the slides. So with that, we're going to get started. So this is our outline for tonight. As I said, unlike the other sessions, this outline's so big it's in 2 columns, right? So we're going to spend a little time on how to read a congregational budget and profit and loss statement, contracting and negotiation as a board, what process observation is, what a consent agenda is and how you use it, board meeting versus board workshop, ways of working as a board together, voting process and consensus process, the really wonderful tool of powerful questions, do a little bit of the difference between doing linkage and talking to constituents and engaging with congregation members, a little bit of the difference between what cottage meeting style of linkage and what town hall style of linkage is. We're going to talk a little bit about board culture assessment, and I'm even going to put into the website at the end of this a wonderful tool that you can use for board culture assessment within your own board. We're going to talk about the board roles and positions and the difference between open and executive sessions, what board covenant means and what it means to speak with one voice, and what healthy conflict looks like for boards. So we're not going to go through everything we did in previous sessions, but this is really us bringing in all the techniques and tools for being an effective board. In our earlier sessions, we did a lot of theory. We did a lot of what it means to be a board, how congregational boards are different than other type of boards. This one's really a technique and tools webinar. And remember always, your Mid-America regional staff is available to you to be able to engage both myself and other members of the staff, primary contacts, and our other consultants. And I also wanted to do an ad. I don't have it up on the screen, but I'm going to let you all know that, you know, if this board class, if this time together has really heightened your engagement and you've got questions and you really want to engage, you can contact us individually. But you can also come to the wonderful Congregational Leaders Check-In that is held every Wednesday on Zoom, usually by one of our wonderful staff members, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Presley. It is every Wednesday, unless there's an exception, but most Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Central. And you can find the link to that and everything on the MidAmerica website and the events page. So, just a reminder, the chat box is here. All of you that have access to the chat box, you can ask questions of me in the chat box. I will be looking over there when I see chats, and I'll integrate questions into the workshop into the webinar as we go along. But if there are, realize that anything you put in the chat is probably public, right? So if there is something that needs some more confidentiality, the chat box is not a place to do that. The slide deck is designed with both graphics and notes. So for those of you who would like to be able to have this resource afterwards, we'll be posting it to the website with the webinar video. When sharing stories or questions, just remember that this is not a confidential space, right? Especially because some of the things that you might have questions about in the chat are going to be things that are particular to your congregation. You know, I did have a webinar where a person in the middle of the webinar named that the board was having significant issues with their minister, and they wanted coaching on how the board should engage with their minister. Well, no one besides the board and the minister up to that point knew that there were significant issues between the minister and the board. And then it was on the video. So the just naming that this is not a confidential space and to be aware of that. We named it was being recorded, and myself and other members of the regional staff are available to you for consultation and support as you know, outside of this webinar. So I do this in every single one of these. We take a moment to talk about the assumptions behind my governance practice. You've probably seen this before. I think it's a wonderful practice. We all have assumptions. The practice is naming them to ourselves and others so that what we share can be judged based upon our best assessment of those assumptions. So real fast, since those of you that have been through the other sessions have heard this already, the purpose of church is not governance. The purpose of church is the congregation's mission. It's transforming the world. So governance is good when it is serving the mission. That culture is stronger than structure. Unless you change the congregation's culture, structural changes will not shift the congregational system. I don't know how many congregations spent a lot of time and effort and even money redesigning a congregation's governance system and redesigning how the board worked and redesigning only to find that everybody was still making decisions exactly the way that they had been making them before, just pretending to be doing it within a different structure or form. The most effective way to make congregational changes is for individuals to change their own functioning. So if you start behaving differently and you get a few other people to start behaving differently, then the rest of the congregational system begins to adapt around you. That's really the only effective way to make changes in a congregation system. And there's no single right way for a congregational board to function. There is no one answer in Unitarian Universalist congregations. We do not have a book of order that says this is the way a church works. This is the way a church board should function. There are, however, some good practices, some things that we've learned from other traditions that may work and from other congregations that may work for you. But there's no best practice. These ideas may or may not work in your system because all of our congregations are unique. That's one of the great blessings of my having had the privilege to work with over 300 congregations in the last 7 years now, is that it really is true that we are as similar and as different as snowflakes. That our congregations really do. The history of the congregation, the history of its relationship to its religious professionals, the history of the community, that all of that really plays in to make unique circumstances for all of our Unitarian Universalist congregations. And so let's jump into how to read a congregational budget or profit loss statement. Now, what I want you to do is look on line 6 of the document. I'm just kidding. Don't look on line 6 of the document before you. The first thing, just like we said before about there is no single way for a congregational board to function, there is no standard when it comes to the design of congregational budgets. I have read, I don't know how many, it seems like hundreds of congregational budgets, and every single one of them is a new and unique creation based upon somebody long ago who designed the formats, business acumen, skill, whether they had small business experience, whether they were coming from academia, that every single one, I have seen congregational spreadsheets in index cards. I mean, congregational budgets done in index cards. I have seen them done in a booklet. I have seen them done in Excel spreadsheets. I have seen them done in QuickBooks that is then downloaded, even where it's done. And that even brings in all the differences in what you call things, because one of the things about Unitarian Universalism is that we don't have a standard of what even to call things. So a line in one budget that says operational maintenance could mean, frankly, anything, right? Because it means what it means in that system. And every congregation has different programs, has different operational needs, has different systemic designs. Every single congregation has different styles and creations of staff. have different staff positions. Every congregation programs are funded, and really what each line item is that funds which part of a congregation's program or operations was often an arbitrary decision made decades ago by somebody who is probably no longer in the congregation. If they are still in the congregation, they're probably still on the finance committee. So you can get an answer. But it was set, and it's far easier to stay in the system that was created than trying to create a new budget design. So very few congregations ever change their budget design. And the decisions behind how that budget was designed and created often, like I said, come from previous experience in different systems, in different, businesses or corporations. And really, in many ways, the budget adapts over time towards different operational needs. There are a few different conceptions for a budget design, and I'm just going to name two of them. One, and we're not going to go deep into either of these because these are webinars all on their own. One of them is a mission budget, and in essence, a budget that is structured and defined based on the congregation's mission. These are really useful because they help keep the understanding of what's important to the congregation in its mission centric in the most values-laden document the congregation actually has, which is its budget. The other is a structural budget, a budget that speaks to is laid out based upon the organization of the congregation. This is by far the most common. So this line item supports this committee. This line item supports this committee. This line item supports this aspect of the program. This line item supports this staffing structure. So a budget that is designed based upon a congregation structure is by far the most common. And I would be willing to bet it's what the majority of congregations of you all have. Mission budgets are rare. One, because they're a moderately new creation in the last 10 to 15 years. So the thing I said before about congregations not wanting to shift their structure once they have one that is working for them runs against mission budgets, but a few of our congregations have them. And different congregations have different disclosure and discernment for the budget, often around issues of staffing and salaries. And the thing I want to say here is that it is good practice for a lot of congregations to not share the breakdown of the salaries in the broader congregation. Other congregations make a very different good practice decision that salaries are part of what the congregation is voting on, and so therefore they need to be seen by the whole of the congregation. So just know that both of those have good practice understandings behind them, and both of them are valid. But I make the case that the board itself needs to see, even if the whole congregation doesn't, the board itself needs to see the full granular budget. So a couple of things, balance sheets and profit loss statements, which are the other primary budgetary documents. They compare the budget to actual financial experience of the congregation, usually on a monthly basis, but not always. I've seen some on quarterly. And frankly, the MidAmerica region runs on a quarterly basis of, the balance sheets and profit and loss statements. Sometimes they include one or more previous years of numbers for the purpose of comparison, which is, I think, the most useful tool to be able to see this is where we are on these line items at this time in this month. This is where we were in these line items at this month last year. And even I've seen a few that went back 2 or 3 years to be able to give that continuity. They're the primary tool for a governing board to track the financial status of the congregation. The budget is useful in defining your values, but it's the profit and loss statement and the balance statement that really tells you and tells your treasurer what is the actual financial status of the congregation in a particular time. Most often, they're in the same line item format as the budget was created in. And I prefer that model because it creates some continuity. There are a few congregations I've seen that have created shrunk versions, smaller versions for the profit and loss statement and the balance sheet. But just to know, most of them follow the same format as the budget. and sometimes include a percentage number of where the line item is as compared with the annual budget for that line item, which is useful and can also be deceiving. What I mean here is that there'll be a line in the profit and loss that says, this is at August, we are 2 months in, so this is how much of a percentage of the annual budget for this line we have used at the end of our second month, right? So that way you can see if we're at 75% of the line item and it's August, we might have a problem with that line item, right? So that's another piece that's useful in those. The budget is primarily a planning document, and the profit and loss and balance sheet are primarily a monitoring documents, if that makes sense. One is for planning, one is for monitoring the actual financial status of the congregation. So I make this case. Some of us have experience outside of church where we have worked closely with budgets and balance sheets and profit and loss statements. But even those of us that have that experience mostly don't have it within the experience of a congregation. And congregations are different than, say, a small business. They're different than a academic department. And so I always, every new board member, I think, should ask for a time with a treasurer or an experienced financial committee member just to spend an hour asking questions and understanding the intricacies of your congregation's budget, balance sheet, and special funds. And the reason for this is it's really hard to do your fiduciary responsibility if the structure is not, if you don't understand the structure and the content of those documents. And it's not a shame that you don't, because every congregation has invented this for themselves. And the structures are really unique to each congregation. So going and asking for just time. Usually an hour is enough for most people, but time with one of your experienced financial lay leaders within the congregation. All right, so that's the finance and budget piece. That was very fast. Remember, your regional staff is available to be able to talk with you, but if there's more that we can help you to engage with that. I spend as much time on this one, and I put it at the beginning of this webinar, because I often find that when I'm interviewing board members a year or two into their service, they've learned this over time. And they could have engaged in understanding the fiduciary responsibilities of the board in a different way had they taken some time at the beginning. So we're going to move to talking about another one of the board responsibilities that relates to some finances, and that's contracting and negotiation. So congregational boards, often, not always, in some congregations, contracting and negotiation in large part is a responsibility of the executive. However you define the executive, be it an executive committee, be it a senior staff member, an executive director. But in many congregations, all contracting and negotiation falls into the realm of the board, of the governing board. So you might make contracts with contract ministers, also letters of call with professional ministers, professional staff and contract employees. And there's a difference between contract employees and at-will employees in that we use the term sometimes, and at-will employees is not the best term here. What I mean is the difference between a contract employees and an independent contractor. An independent contractor is someone who is not an employee of the congregation, but is in a contracted relationship that is term limited, that is for a specific purpose. A contract employee is an employee of the congregation under federal employment rules who is hired under a contract of circumstances, compensation, benefits, and serves under that contract, right? Serves for a term under that contract, rather than an at-will employee who is hired but not under a contract, under a job description, that then is employed indefinitely under that job description. If that makes sense. Some of the other contracts that a board might engage with is consultants of the region. When we work with a congregation to have one of our adjunct consultants come to be with you for doing workshops or trainings or board retreats, or any of the other things that our adjunct consultants are available to your congregations for, we do a contracting process with you, the board, to be able to contract for that person's services. Vendors and service providers. Vendors such as website vendors, plumbing, business, somebody's going to paint your sanctuary for you. All different kinds of contracts that may come to a governing board. Sometimes there are contracts with donors, especially with very large bequeathments, and that conversations need to be had about how the congregation is going to receive those donations, and it takes some work for a board. Renters and landlords for facilities use. I look forward to the day that many of our congregations are we're back in our facilities and such, that we have people sharing our facilities with us, which is one of our best ministries. Being able to have a space in the community that people of similar values and beliefs to ours can utilize. But that takes some contracting. And we talked about called ministers and letter of calls, contracting with financial institutions, departing financial institutions such as for mortgages for the congregation, contracts with departing ministers, professional staff, or employees. During an ending, there are times where a separation process involves some contracting and negotiation. Members of the congregation sometimes they're members and friends of the congregation, sometimes around behavioral issues, that there's a need for a board to negotiate with them about what their engagement with the congregation will be. And sometimes other congregations in cluster or partnership agreements. So I'm going to start first with professional staff contracting. So the UUA Office of Church Staff Finance, if you're not aware of them, they are this wonderful group of people at the UUA that do a lot of things, including running the UUA healthcare program and retirement program and some of the other benefits programs. But they also have a couple of consultants who work directly with congregations to provide resources, support, and consulting on staffing issues. They're not a full HR department for your congregation, but they are consultants that are available to you when you're dealing with a difficult staffing issue. And the way you connect with them most times is to reach out to one of the members of your regional staff, and we'll help you first. And if we need to, we'll refer you to the Office of Church Staff Finance. They do a wonderful newsletter. I think it's called Compensation News, that you can sign up for, that's got great material, and they're really tracking what are the changes in law, especially at the federal level, around compensation and staffing in congregations. They also put out the salary recommendations that are based upon position and geographical location for many church positions. That is a wonderful resource. And they do have compensation consultants that can help with congregations in negotiations, specifically around ministers and sometimes religious educators. Now, we also, as your MidAmerica staff, are available to support you all on professional staff on contracting and how to coach your board, as well as the transitions coaches for the UUA are able to do that as well. So there are tons of resources that are available to you when you're negotiating, specifically around negotiating with your professional staff, with ministers, with religious educators, with membership directors and music directors, and administrators, and membership professionals. And so reach out to us. Which resources would cost money? That's a great question. Consulting is for consulting, the cost for that, reaching out to your regional staff and even getting referred to the Office of Church Staff Finance. Thank you for your congregation's donations to the annual program fund of the UUA that let me have this really cool job. That's one of the things that you all, in supporting the association, are having available to you because of that support for the association. There is some additional cost when it comes to transitions coaching. I'm not going to name what those are, but when the congregation's in search for a new minister, and some additional cost for adjunct consultants when one of those isn't appropriate for your congregation. And that really depends, the answer of what the cost is really depends on the consultation itself. So my guidelines, David's guidelines for congregational contracting. These are the things that I love to see congregations to do. These are my good practices. And so, from working with congregations around contracting and negotiation. If major financial commitments are involved, err on the side of getting official, legal, or a financial officer opinion. The UUA doesn't provide that service mainly for the reason, legal services or official financial officer opinions, mainly because that involves state law, and the UUA doesn't have the ability to consult on those issues cross state lines. So really, with 50 states plus some territories, it would be impossible for us to do that. So we recommend, if a major financial commitment is involved, pay a little money to get either some legal advice or a financial officer, a financial expert from your community to be able to give you that advice. Use outside consultants as necessary in addition to the UUA staff. I've mentioned one before, one consulting firm before, Stewardship for Us, which is a stewardship consulting firm that is UU centered. If you're any questions related to stewardship impact upon finances, they're a great one to reach out to. There are also some other contracting and negotiation consultants and communities that are often very useful for congregations. Use reputable and bonded vendors whenever you possibly can, right? There's this wonderful thing about our congregations that a member of our congregation, Mary, knows Bob. Bob has been having a hard time, but Bob is a good plumber, even though he's not bonded, or he doesn't have, but Mary wants to do something nice for Bob, and the board wants to do something nice for Mary. So Mary, the board contracts with Bob, or even just ask him to come in and do the plumbing work. And next thing we know, the plumbing work wasn't done well, and there's no real recourse. So though sometimes it costs more, though sometimes the need, and it is, I always recommend congregations use licensed and bonded and reputable contractors whenever you can. There are occasions where that's difficult to do, and I recognize that, but whenever you can, it's a really good practice. This is also the story about Mary before. Avoid vendor contacts with close congregational connections if you possibly can. One of the things that regularly happens is a vendor for some service is a member of the congregation, and they're willing to give the congregation a great rate. And that works wonderfully if the service works wonderfully, but sometimes it doesn't. And then the congregation is in the position where a service that they've depended on, a service they've received, like one of the regular ones that this happens for is architectural design, doesn't meet the congregation's needs or standards. And there's no real way to hold the person accountable without damaging the relationship of that person to their faith community and the faith community's relationship to the person. So it is sometimes it has worked wonderfully and well, and it's always taking a risk of one of the most precious things to us, which is those relationships with those who are members and part of our congregation. Consider justice implications of a contracting decision. I skipped the one. Avoid contracts that require to be with an individual rather than the congregation. It's almost always a red flag. If somebody says, I can't do an agreement with this congregation, I need a person to be the responsible person. If they're not able to work with the Constitution the congregation as an institution, that's probably a sign that you want to check a little deeper into that vendor. This often happens with websites, with web vendors and other things. So lots of congregations have lost control of their websites because of this problem. Consider the justice implications of a contracting decision, but not the only factor. And what I mean by that is, pay attention to who you're using as vendors and whether or not you are diverse and equitable in that hiring, whether it is perfectly appropriate to give a precedence to minority-owned vendors. Not at the exclusion of some of these other things, however. Not at the exclusion of them being bonded, of them having the ability to work with the institution rather than an individual, right? But it is an appropriate decision to choose, even sometimes to pay more. In fact, I think that's a wonderful justice decision, to pay more for a contract because it's with a minority-owned a minority-owned vendor. The larger the contract, the larger the process of congregational disclosure. So does the congregation need to know about the $300 plumbing bill from Bob? Probably not. From Bob's Plumbing? Probably not. Should there be a lot of congregational disclosure prior to the $30,000 rebuild of the steeple? Probably. Boards have at times signed very large contracts with vendors and then turned around to discover that the fact that they did not do a congregational process related to that larger funding created a relationship problem between the congregation and the board. And all congregations should be reviewed by a contract review team. Now, it doesn't have to be called a contract review team. There's lots of things you could name it. It could be your executive team, it could be the board as a whole. But one person should not develop the contract, negotiate with the vendor, and then sign the contract. There should be a process where multiple people see that contract. I think even when it's the $300 plumbing contract with Bob's Plumbing, right? There should be a process where multiple eyes see that within the congregation. And it could be a subcommittee of the governing board. So we went through budgets and profit and loss statements and contracting. Now for something completely different. So everybody take a deep breath. Remember, we're doing a lot in this workshop, in this webinar. So process observation. This is another technique and tool that is really useful for governing boards in learning more about how you're functioning, how people are engaged with one another. What are the things that the board is doing well? What are the things that the board has a challenge with? What are the things the board is not seeing? And there's lots of different ways to do process observation, but the key of it is someone, maybe more than one person, maybe a board member, sometimes not, in the board meeting specifically observing the board's own processes and practices and how board members engage with each other, what the relationships look like, where the emotional energy is, how the board deals with conflict. There's two main types. We're going to talk about each of them in a minute: question focus process observation and board dynamics process observation. Some boards also have a style of process observation that integrates both of these forms, and we're going to go through the forms so you get a feel for it. It's usually a trustee at large, not an officer, will agree to participate in the meeting as a process observer. So usually this is, in some congregations, this is a responsibility that rotates between the trustees at large to be able to hold the role of process observer. I will say, however, there are some congregations that have asked someone to come in and simply participate, be present in the board meetings, not participating, but solely as a process observer, to come into board meetings to then reflect back to the board how the board was together. Now that's a hard lift for some congregations which have a hard enough time getting enough people to be willing to be board members and trustees at large. But it is something that can be useful, whether it's done as a trustee at large or somebody from outside the board. I have, on occasion, for some boards, offered to come in for one board meeting, virtually and a few times in person, to do process observation for a board that is struggling for some reason, that is having some particular challenges or problems. So question-focused process observation, the first of these two styles that I'm talking about, is a series of questions that the board negotiates beforehand that they will use at the end of each session to ask themselves how they were together in this session, how the process worked. They're often these questions and the questions are different for every board because they're focused in part on areas where the board perceives they need to be more attentive. Usually there are 2 to 5 questions, 3 is a good number, that the board is going to react to, that the board is going to respond to at the end of the board meeting. Question that came in the chat, do I recommend that this is done at every board meeting or periodically? I would say that I would love it. I recommend it be done at every board meeting because it's looking at the relationships and looking at how the board processes. And I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, right? So even beginning with doing process observation once or twice a year as a starting point is probably better than not beginning it at all. And it also begins to build in the practice in the board. Boards that do this for a little while get in the rhythm of it. It gets into the expectations. So the questions can be used to make sure the board is functioning at the fullness of their responsibilities. Questions are also used to ensure that the board includes particular issues and viewpoints in their deliberations. For a while, the UUA Board of Trustees had a set of questions for their process observation that really focused on how the board was engaging diversity of viewpoint, both in centering marginalized voices within the UUA Board of Trustees, but also how they managed when there was a dominant viewpoint among the board, that how do they manage the making space for all alternative viewpoints to that dominant viewpoint. So some example questions that could be, how did we engage in equity in this meeting? And then have board members together discuss, all the board together discuss how equity it played out in the meeting. Was there equity of time? Did people speak in was there space enough for everybody to have the ability to speak in the board, or did one voice dominate the board meeting? Was there equity in the relationship with the staff? Did we engage in questions of equity in how we made decisions, or how we made decisions and voted on things within the board? Was there space for viewpoints that were not the main, that were not in the majority within the board? That's one kind of question. That's one question that it works well as a process observation question. What was not said in the meeting is a wonderful process observation question and question focus. What did not get said? It's almost a what is the elephant in the room? But what did not get said in the meeting? Another great one that I love is what was felt in the meeting. I love this one because people are able to say things like, well, when so-and-so didn't vote with us, I was angry, right? And being able to name that, because those feelings are a live part of the board meeting, but making a space for them to be expressed. What was felt in the meeting? I felt really sad about the decision we had to make about this member who has been disruptive. And there wasn't a space in talking about that for me to say that I felt really sad that this is where we were. Who held the floor in the meeting? Who held the most? Who held the floor the least? Why was there a difference, right? These are all the kinds of questions. I'm not gonna, there are hundreds of questions that could be used, but the key of it is the board agrees in advance, usually over a period of multiple meetings, even of a whole board year or longer, that these are the questions we're going to engage at the end of each meeting to talk about how we've been together. That's the core, and then the board discusses those questions together at the close of the meeting. Board dynamics process observation is a little different in that it is not really about a set of questions. It's about inviting someone, whether it's a board member or whether it's somebody from outside the board, to observe the relationship flow, to observe the emotional content, to observe how people are together. It's reported usually along the structure of the board meeting agenda, so that when the process observer comes back, they're using the board meeting agenda to talk about what happened, what they observed, what they, at different points in the board meeting. So, you know, it talks about the emotional content of the meeting. There was a space in over whether or not to remove the minister's report from the consent agenda, where there was some tension in the room between the minister and the vice president. And the process observer would name that. There was a space in our discussing the Religious Education Committee's budget allocation request where two board members appeared to be holding back tears. or where one person spoke 90% of the time in this one section of the agenda. The process observer does to name these things in as honest, as I don't believe in neutral, but in as honest a way as they can, and responds to questions that happen. But it's really someone who is observing the process of the meeting and then reporting back to the board at the end what they saw. All right, another deep breath. We're going to move to another. Told you, this is a whole grab bag of stuff, this one. So the voting process versus consensus process. Now, most of us believe our boards, and our boards are written in the documents, usually meant to function in a voting process. Where a motion is made, there is discussion, we then amend the motion, and then there's a decision. Few boards actually function formally under that kind of voting process. It sets the ideal in making a decision, this kind of process. Voting processes say the most important thing is that we make a decision. And it has some specific cultural attachments. It's designed around white supremacy cultural context, that the outcome is the most important thing. It allows people to utilize it. The other piece is the voice of the majority has an overwhelming impact upon the process because the voting will be by majority rule. Even to the point in formal voting processes, the majority has the ability to silence the minority and move on to the vote. So understand that there are some deep cultural attachments that are based in white supremacy culture that are in voting processes. There are ways to manage that and limit that. We're going to talk about consensus process in a few minutes and a hybrid of the two. Voting process is most useful in very large group settings because when there are so many people, when there are so many people utilizing a formal process can be effective. Whereas consensus process, which we'll get to in a minute, makes getting to a decision in that the larger the group, the harder it is to get to a decision, is what I think I'm trying to say there. And it privileges majority opinions. Consensus process, which is easily defined, although there's several different forms, but the basic one is there's a question, not a motion, there's a question. We have a discussion. We see if anyone feels so strongly in opposition to the question, in opposition to the direction of the discussion, that they are willing to block, that they say, I cannot live with this and remain in relationship. Through discussion and blocking, that leads to adaptation and continued, maybe more blocking, maybe more adaptation, maybe more blocking, maybe more adaptation, discussion and adaptation, which eventually leads to moving the group towards a consensus decision. This is a harder process. There's a commitment that you stay in discussion and adaptation until there is a decision, or that you postpone discussion and adaptation if consensus cannot be reached. That there isn't the space in full consensus process, you're making the commitment that you're not going, that relationship is the most important thing, not the decision itself. That maintaining the community and maintaining the relationships and staying at the table with one another is the most important thing. And realize sometimes people may need to leave the table because those discussions can be very difficult. And touch on, if any of you are remember the biggest experience of consensus decision-making process was Occupy Wall Street. The biggest, most public in many years was Occupy Wall Street, which sought to solely function from a consensus process structure. It does seek more collaborative decisions. It's mostly useful in smaller settings that are focused on community, which was one of the challenges of Occupy Wall Street using this process, was that it was very large settings. And it protects minority opinions. It protects the voices at the margins, both at the margins of a decision and at the cultural and racial margins within the group. that it does, consensus process makes space for those. And allows them the ability to say, look, you all, the majority of you may agree with this, but it's going to harm me in this way, and I can't let us move forward until we address that, until we have had the conversations necessary to adapt towards a decision that brings all of us together. So most congregational boards and most congregations function somewhere between these two systems. Congregations tend to go more fully to one or the other during stress and conflict. Most congregations tend to go to voting under stress. And some congregations even write that into their policy. That one of the hybrid adaptations of this is that a congregation board commits to using consensus process until consensus process cannot reach a decision for a period of a certain number of board meetings, in which case then and only then will the board engage a voting process. Or when it's determined that the decision is so time critical that it would cause irreparable harm if if consensus process did not lead to a decision. Different board members, and this is one of the reasons, the great reasons for board policy books, is because when you have a hybrid system where you use consensus process, having discussion and adaptation, and eventually you reach the point, even if it's informal, that the board mostly agrees on the decision, and then you take a formal vote for it. Even when you use those processes, when the system is under stress, when there is conflict, and the board goes to voting when not everybody has been able to come on board in an informal consensus process, that can cause damage in the relationships between board members, and in relationships with the congregation. So be clear about the practices of how you're using a decision-making process, whether you are using solely a voting-based process or whether you're using solely a consensus-based process, or as most congregations do, a hybrid between the two, which is usually, and it's the good practice that I recommend, a process where the board will remain in consensus for a certain period of time based upon the priority of the decision, how important, how time critical the decision is. Stay in that consensus process until such time as a decision has to be made, and then and only then move to the backup of an actual voting process. And board members should be empowered to ask which of these versions of decision-making process is being used when that's unclear. So another big thing, another wonderful tool is a consent agenda. Usually when I'm doing this workshop in person, at this point I ask everybody to wave their hand and tell me if their board uses a consent agenda. Consent agenda is a really easy thing in concept and sometimes a difficult thing for our congregations to do. It's simply this. There are many, and I'm not going to read the whole slide. There are many things that come before a congregational board that board members just need to know about, or that can be engaged by asking questions of clarity prior to the meeting. One of the primary examples of this, we talked about it before, is financial documents, treasurer's report, minister's report, anything where it is data that the congregation is taking in. Policies that have been debated in the board before have been adapted and are now coming back to the board just for approval. Reports from committees. All of these things that can be engaged by the board beforehand are possible inclusions in what's the consent agenda. Here's the way a consent agenda works. A certain number of days prior to the board meeting, the board members get a packet that has everything that's in the consent agenda. These are items that they can read beforehand. They can read and peruse the financial reports. They can read and peruse the treasurer's interpretation of the financial reports, the minister's report on what's happening in the congregation, the report from different committees. They can engage them beforehand, and if they have any questions, they can bring those questions to the board meeting. Early in the board meeting, usually after the approval of the minutes, the consent agenda comes up for approval. The entire consent agenda. If there is a policy that's been written that the board's engaged with and it's in the consent agenda, when the board votes to approve the consent agenda, everything in the consent agenda is approved and entered into the minutes as approved. So the financial reports are accepted. The minister's report is accepted. If there's something, however, that a board member, in reading through these materials prior to the board meeting, if there's a question or something that a board member wants to talk about, they have the ability, when the consent agenda comes up, to say, I vote we remove the minister's report from the consent agenda this month. And at any board, or I request that we remove the minister's report. Any board member requesting something be removed from the consent agenda has it removed from the consent agenda at that request, and it goes into the agenda of the meeting so that that discussion can happen. But if no discussion is necessary, the board takes a vote and approves all of those things that take up so much time in board meetings. Now, the discipline of this, there's 3 disciplines that a board has to learn. The first is reports and materials have to be in early enough to be collated and sent to the board members prior to the board meeting with enough time to engage it. That takes some learning. That takes some muscle memory. That takes ministers like me knowing to get their report in the Wednesday prior to the board, not the Wednesday of the board. The second, same thing with the financial reports. It just takes some muscle memory within the system to be able to shift that. The second muscle memory, the second practice that's needed to do a consent agenda well, is that everybody has to engage the material before the board meeting, right? Everybody has to have read through the consent agenda packet before they come to the board meeting and formulated any questions they have or know what element they may want to bring, off for discussion. And the last practice is really just helping the congregation adapt to the idea that just because it's not spoken in the board meeting does not mean it's not important. That, I know that for me, when one of the boards I served as a minister went to a consent agenda, I had this visceral reaction to the fact that I wasn't going to spend 15 minutes of the board meeting basically telling the board everything I thought was important in my minister's report. Right? I mean, I had to, they'd all read it, but I just was so used to the idea that I had this time that I could tell the board that, and this is what I thought was great about this, and this is what I thought was, and letting go of that in order to make space for the board to do other work was both an act of trust for me, and it was a loss that I had to grieve a little bit. So knowing that, and that's true for committees who are used to coming to the board to present their request for new funds for a new flower garden, committees coming that want to, or members that have a proposal that they want to put before the board. All of those things can go in the consent agenda, but helping the congregation adapt to the idea that time in the board meeting may not be available in the same way it was before. So next technique and practice is one that I'll mention very briefly. It's called board workshop / board meeting. And this is simply this. Boards meet to do a board meeting, and there is a structure, there is an agenda, there is a process. But not all of the work of a board works well in that process that is developed. And some things need longer time than a board meeting really designed that has so many different items on the agenda. So board workshop is a process where the board can come together either in the regular board meeting time or in a different time in a less formal setting to have more creative conversations. Is there a reason to have the details of, Willa Schultz asks, is there a reason to have the details of the consent agenda available to the congregation? Once the consent agenda is accepted, all the elements in it become part of the minutes. They're not necessarily in the minutes, but the consent agenda itself becomes part of the board's official record. So it's a good point for me to raise. Executive items in executive session don't go in a consent agenda, right? Just to be aware of that. So when you vote to accept it, you're voting to accept all the elements, and so that means, yes, they would be available to the congregation. The basic premise of a board workshop is finding a time that the board can meet to discuss something, to engage something deeper that's not the board meeting. that you don't always have to meet in the structure of the official board meetings with voting and all that. Being able to come together, I served a board, the Joseph Priestley District Board. I was district executive for 4 years. And all of our board meetings were structured this way. We would spend 3 days in board workshop, 2 to 3 days in board workshop setting, having informal conversations, writing stuff on boards, engaging. And our board meeting under official rules was the last hour and a half of that 3 days together. But in the board workshop, we had already made most of the decisions. We had had the conversations in that less formal structure. So when we came to the last hour and a half, what we were doing was wordsmithing the final versions of whatever the motions were and voting, because we had done the work of that discernment in that less formal structure of a board workshop. Now, it doesn't have to be 3-day board meetings. So just to think about this as a way that the board can function. Next technique or tool is open questions and powerful questions. I love this technique or tool. That is the ability for a board to make space in their board meetings. This is one of the things that you have room to do when you do a consent agenda, to buy space in your board meeting, to spend 20 to 40 minutes of a board meeting on a question that the board is going to engage, in which there will be no decision made about that question. There is no product that comes out of it. It is simply the board doing its discernment about the mission and vision of the congregation, the future health and vitality of Unitarian Universalism together in a almost covenant group format. And to reserve 20 to 40 minutes of time for the board simply to sit together to engage this question. And it could be a different question every month. It could be the same question for a year. That every board meeting there is going to be a space where board members, where there's no voting, there's no decisions being made, there is just a conversation. So that you as board members deepen your understanding of each other and your relationship to the congregation and to Unitarian Universalism, and you're discerning together what's important to the congregation. Decisions about an open question may come out of that, but they will not be voted at the meeting that the open question is about. So if the open question is, what would it mean for our congregation to invest in a campus ministry? There will not be a vote in that meeting about investing in a campus ministry. There will just be a conversation about what it would mean if the congregation had a campus ministry as part of its program. And the board members engage and discuss that question. I use this one as an example. A congregation that I won't name where, but that has a beautiful historic building, had their board spend, I think it was 3 or 4 months, on the open question of who would we be as a congregation if we no longer had this building. This was pre-COVID. And the board engaged this question, and then they later took this open question to the whole congregation. And it became a really good discernment tool for what was the most important parts of the congregation to themselves and to the congregation as a whole. So the space of this, the discipline of this is, how do you get the 20 to 40 minutes? And we're going to talk about a couple of the techniques, but this is one of the things when you gain time from the use of a consent agenda, this is what I think, this is one of the best ways to use that for. And I also make the recommendation that you put that 20 to 40 minutes, put that open question conversation right after the approval of the consent agenda. So it's the first thing, that everything else in the board, because board agendas, board time will expand. The amount of time we spend on something in a governing board most times expands based upon the time that is available. So if you make this discernment conversation, which is really engaging in the mission, vision, discernment part of the 7 board practices, when you put this at the beginning, you're protecting the time for this important discernment conversation. And boards that do this well tell me that the board service begins to feel like a covenant group on the vitality of the congregation and the mission of the church. So a few questions. What does the community around us need from our congregation? That's a great open question. Open questions are always ones that cannot be answered with a yes or no, and that lead to deeper understanding of mission and vision. What might our staffing needs look like in 5 years? How might stewardship need to transform as generations change? So cottage meetings versus town halls. These names change based upon different, forms of linkage. Linkage is the fancy governance term for how boards communicate with and talk to their constituents, those that they serve, the congregants, but also community groups and people that use your space. There's quite a few different, in our understanding that we talked about, of the fiduciary responsibility of the board. So we're going to talk a little bit about these two. Cottage meetings are designed to create an intimate or conversational setting for conversation among congregants. Usually they're held in a living room with a group no more than 10 or 11. The board wants to gather specific information on specific topics. They want to hear from the congregation in that informal setting where people are able to really engage in conversation with one another. And usually a good cottage meeting creates groups, brings groups of people together who don't normally come together within the congregation. So if it's not the religious education committee, or it's not a cottage meeting of all the members of the choir, right? Good cottage meetings bring people together in the congregation in groups that they may not normally form in, because so you hear from a diverse, engaged group within the congregation. And Powerful Questions is actually a really good framework for using in cottage meetings. Many congregations do cottage meetings around stewardship. It's often part of a capital campaign. Another time that cottage meetings will often become part of a process is during the search for a new religious professional, a minister or a religious educator or membership professional, or even a music director. So town halls, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Most congregations do town halls at some point, where it's designed really to put forth information and receive direct response. The board is presenting the budget and receiving responses from the congregation about the draft budget, right? That's a town hall. Or the board is going to put forth our new strategic plan and receive response from members of the congregation in that strategic plan. Usually conducted for the whole congregation, even though that's rarely do you get the whole congregation to attend. If the whole congregation attends, that's probably a sign that this is something that's probably pretty controversial and need to be careful with. Focused on communication from between the congregation and the governing board, rather than an interpersonal dialogue between members of people who are participating in a cottage meeting. And it uses a presentation question and answer format. I'm not going to go deep. We all see town halls. Town halls exist in politics. They exist in lots of different places. But these are two of the primary ways that boards do their linkage responsibility in engaging with stakeholders in a formal way. I'm not going to spend a lot more time. I'll take a little more time with this. Cottage meetings take the most time to prepare, because really good cottage meeting structures require sign up and invitation, because you're going to have to try and limit the number of people in a group to a group that can have a dialogue together. Usually no more than 10 or 12. And that usually means they either have to sign up on a list with only 10 or 12 spaces, or it's by invitation. And the invitation is more difficult to pull off, but it does help you to be more discerning about how you build the cottage meeting groups so that they have good dialogue, that many things are represented. Usually involves some light refreshment or dessert. I don't recommend doing full meals with this, but having some hors d'oeuvres, or I love cottage meetings that do dessert, frankly. Often in someone's home, but sometimes also to offer them within the congregation. They require a facilitator to ask the question and keep people engaged, a note taker, and a host for each meeting, usually 7 to 12 congregants or other stakeholders, and caretaking to bring up the normal congregational groups. I will say that if you're going to do a cottage meeting, I have a whole PowerPoint presentation on how to do cottage meetings that I can send out to anyone who asks me for it, and I can coach you through being able to help your congregation do that. For town halls, you see the pieces. You announce the meeting space, people come, there's a specific agenda item. It does have a tendency to produce biased reporting in town halls because the only people who come are the people motivated for some reason around the issue. So it often can seem like there is a higher level of interest or engagement than may actually be in the whole of the congregation because of that biased nature of who chooses to come. So board culture assessment, I'm going to, in the interest of time, move us through this and just say there's a couple of wonderful tools. I'm going to put one up in the slide for you all to be able to ask questions about your board. What are the commonalities about who serves in the board? How might they be here? How is worship part of our board practice? So we'll name that in the interest of time and me talking too much. I'm going to push past this one and you'll get a tool for this. And that's what the tool looks like, by the way. So it'll come out with the slides. Board roles and positions. You know, this is really in a base level course. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one. It'll be in the slides if you wish them. But understand that there is no one design for a congregational board. And congregations can create whatever positions or officers they wish within a board structure. Some boards have ex officio roles. So someone who is not a board member, but participates in a board because of another role that they have. Many ministers serve as ex officio members of the congregation. Ex officio does not necessarily mean without vote. It means board member by right of office. Some congregations have treasurers who are not board members but serve as ex officio, who are not elected as board members but serve as ex officio board members because of that position of being a treasurer. So run through the more standard ones. The president, chair or moderator of a congregation, treasurer, financial officer, maybe an elected board member, maybe ex officio board member. One thing about the president is presidents in congregations sometimes are the chief executive officer, have the operational authority. Sometimes presidents have no operational authority at all, that they are simply the chair of the board. And that spectrum can be very confusing. Sometimes they are the person responsible for all of the operations and management of a congregation, even some larger congregations. I worked with one that was a 350 member congregation where the president was the chief operating officer and that meant the chief operating officer changed every year in that congregation, which created operational problems. They often can sign contracts on behalf of the congregation. One other thing I'll say about treasurers and financial officers, they may or may not be involved in stewardship, just as an awareness in different congregational settings. Vice president, chair and moderator, and secretary. The vice president conducting the role of the president, however it's defined in the absence of the president, may succeed the president, but sometimes not. Maybe sometimes the vice president is an independent role that you're elected to without a succession, and may have specific roles laid out in policy. Oftentimes, the vice president, say, will be the chair of the council of committees, or will be a member of the executive team. Secretary is another one that's interesting in that it may be a board officer and may not. Maybe a recording secretary who is not a member of the board at all, but is just attending board meetings to do the actual record keeping. Records the business and make sure they're available. Verify, as in many states, the secretary has a responsibility to verify that the board is abiding by its bylaws and other documents and state law. May or may not be the person actually taking minutes. I think that boards show a vote of love for their secretary when the board somehow share the responsibility for the minute taking. But some secretaries choose to do that because they're responsible for the record keeping. Some other categories of board roles: trustee, director, or delegate. Voting board member may have responsibilities on subcommittees. In some congregations may rotate through officer positions and then back to trustee and delegate. Some boards elect their own officers, others the congregation elects the officers. Just know that all those are normal practices. And minister and religious educator. I am over time again. So last thing I'm going to do, and you'll have the slides on conflict within boards that are pretty robust. But open session versus executive session. I'll spend a few minutes with this simply because it's such a place where there is challenge. Open session is a public meeting that anybody can attend, and business may be conducted, motions and voting. Open sessions are recorded in the minutes. Board members may attend as well as the congregation and the public. Presiding officer may invite public participation in discussion depending on board policy, and this is for the majority of board business. Executive session is a very specific thing. It's a closed meeting only for board members and specific invited individuals. And here's the key. It includes all ex officio board members, whether they are voting or not. That if your minister is ex officio, they are included in the understanding of that executive session. Now, if you have an executive session where you're going to be discussing the minister in a way that the board wishes and needs to have some time without the minister or ex officio member present, the best practice is to ask them to recuse themselves. And if that becomes a problem, that there's debate about whether they're willing to engage that, that's one of the times I invite you to reach out to your regional staff to help with that conversation. No business can be conducted in executive session. In other words, no votes. No decisions are made in executive session. And no minutes can be taken because no minutes can be taken. The decision can't be recorded because no minutes are taken in the executive session. So any decisions that the board comes to, any outcomes the board comes to in executive session must come back into open session to be voted and included in the official minutes. The conversation from executive session does not necessarily need to come into that open session minutes, but any decisions do. So we are 1 minute away from time. As you know, I kind of thought I wouldn't make it through everything in the time period that we have, but all the slides will be there. I'm going to show you what is in there in the slides when you get them. Is talking about board covenants and how boards form covenants. We also have in the slides what speaking with one voice means, speaking as a board, where as a board member you make the commitment that when a decision is made in good process, when a decision is made by the board, you will support that decision publicly even if you didn't agree with it in the debate within the board. And the reason for that is protecting the board's authority within the congregation. That's not every board makes this commitment, but it is a powerful one for protecting and nurturing the board's relationship of trust with the congregation. And then there's a few slides on healthy conflict for boards. Boards do have conflicts and how to do them well. And so there's just, the slides will talk about what is a healthy conflict and what in a board and what does an unhealthy conflict in a board look like. And some keys for how to engage in healthy conflict as a congregational board. Once again, your regional staff is always here and available to support you. Thank you for coming to these sessions, and I'm grateful and that you've been able to engage in this time with us. And I wish I had been able to do this a little faster the last two sessions. But I want to thank you for coming and know that we are here and available, and the slides will be available in the next few days along with the recording. Thank you very much, and you all have a wonderful, blessed evening.